Welcome, everyone. My name is Samantha Shokin. I manage public programs at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust in New York. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's program of When Light Pierced the Darkness, a Danish rescue story. I'm joined today by Leo Goldberger, who is a psychologist and psychology professor at NYU. Leo is well known for his work in sensory deprivation, personality, stress, and coping, as well as for his writings on the rescue of the Danish Jews during the Holocaust. Leo's formative years were spent in Copenhagen, where he grew up and where he endured the German occupation, escaping by fishing boat to Sweden during the Nazi roundup of Jews in October of 1943. His book, Rescue of the Danish Jews, is available on Amazon and on all digital booksellers. And interviewing Leo today is Damian Slattery. Damian is a screenwriter who has written numerous scripts, including A Day in October, which tells the inspiring tale of the rescue of Danish Jews during World War II, and which Leo was a story consultant on during its filming in the 90s. More recently, Damian has written an English language adaptation of the classic Danish film, Harry and the Butler, which was Oscar nominated for Best Foreign Language Film in 1961. An experienced documentary writer, Damian has also written for National Geographic TV, History, Discovery, and more, and has also worked in publishing for decades at iconic brands like Sports Illustrated, Time, and currently Fast Company. So before I turn it over to our speakers for today, I'd like to remind everyone that we will have a Q&A session at the conclusion of the program. So around 2:45, we'll give about 15 minutes. We'll have 15 minutes for audience Q&A. And if you would like to ask a question, please submit your questions either into the chat box or into the Q&A form, and we will do our best to get it to as many as possible. And also, this program is being recorded and will be available on YouTube early next week. So I will be sure to send out a link to that recording to all of today's registrants in my follow-up email. So that is it from me. And without further ado, please welcome Damian and Leo.
Thank you, Samantha, and thank you everyone for joining us today. This is an enormous personal and professional moment of pleasure and pride for me to reunite with Leo Goldberger. 95% of Denmark's Jews were rescued and saved, and Leo is one of them. But he is not just a survivor. He is a student, an expert of the Holocaust and the Danish experience. And so it is through those two lenses, that double lens, that we will talk a lot today. First, as Samantha referenced, it was about 30 years ago that Leo opened his heart, his home, his history, and his homeland, as well as his faith and family, to me, so that I could write a film. While it was fictionalized, it would be authentic and true. And Leo steered me. He opened the door to gaps in my education around the Holocaust, to learning that I needed to do to be worthy of writing a script of that experience. And I am forever grateful to him for making me a brother in the learning about the Holocaust through his great book, The Rescue of the Danish Jews, Moral Courage Under Stress. Leo, thank you. How are you doing before we get into the details?
Thank you so much for your kind words. I'm doing pretty well considering the pandemic, which does focus on things I was interested in, as you know, sensory deprivation, isolation. However, I'm doing okay.
Excellent, excellent. So Leo, I want to start, I'm going to share the screen and I'm going to show, I've got a photograph that I want to start with, not that one, this one. I want you to introduce your family to us. And I think the point I want you to emphasize is this is a photograph that most Jewish families never got to take during the World War II European Holocaust. This is post-rescue. So talk about having this picture.
Yeah, it's a good point, because I lost most of my extended families because they remained in the Austro-Hungarian Empire countries of Hungary and Czechoslovakia. My dad was imprisoned by deciding to leave that part of the world and move to Denmark in 1934, just when Hitler was really beginning to be a menace. The picture shows from the right my little brother, Eric, my mother, Helen, myself, my older brother, Milan, my dear father, and my other kid brother, Gus, who lives in Washington, D.C. and is watching this now. Hi, Gus.
That's great. So you're going to be talking about them a bit as we go forward, Leo. The subhead of your book was Moral Courage Under Stress. You've given talks on your Danish study and experience, and you call it light piercing the darkness. The two feel very similar. Just give us a little look into those two ideas of moral courage under stress and light piercing the darkness, those twin messages.
Well, the lightness obviously was the rescue, which was a novel experience for most Jews in Europe at the time. And the idea that I had was to focus on the stress experienced by most of us in trying to escape and to make contact with brave, morally courageous people, the Danish people, and quite a few resistance fighters who spontaneously, without the involvement of any organization as such, decided that we were human beings and that we mattered. And they decided, and I emphasize the fact that it was spontaneous, they decided to do whatever they could to find out where we were, to locate us by telephone books and what have you, and then offered to help us contact fishermen. So to me, that was the lightness that pierced the obviously unspeakable time of the Holocaust with death camps, etc. I don't have to tell you how dark that chapter is in our history.
So Leo, I want to, as much as we have 45 minutes to an hour to talk, yeah. I know you could go on for much longer than that. So I really wanted to focus on 3 different moments in the Danish story and get your perspective of Leo, the young boy at the time. You have a painterly screenwriter's-like ability to tell those stories, to recall those memories. So I want that, and then I want that professor, scholar, historian perspective as well. So if you could you start with the first major event in the Danish experience of April 9th, 1940, describe it from that childhood, young lived Leo experience.
Yeah, it was April the 9th, 1940, when I woke up to the terrible noise overhead. There were these German Messerschmitts, these big airplanes. They were darkening the sky, flying very low and dropping leaflets in broken Danish and German. And I believe I was the first to pick it up in my apartment because my window faced the street. And I brought it to my parents' attention. And obviously, it was the biggest shock because we had a non-aggression pact with Germany, which had just been signed fairly recently. And this broke the contract we had. And before long, the entire city was filled with tanks and soldiers. And our devoted king was on the radio and telling us what had happened and that we should take it easy, not to fight, to go back to work, to go to school, and that things would work out okay. That was the first that I heard. And obviously I was absolutely distraught because my parents, as you can imagine, were desperate. They thought this was the end because they hadn't heard from their own families in a long time by that time.
You were just 9 on that day, Leo.
Yeah.
What kind of confusion, fear, uncertainty can you tap from that moment?
The most significant feeling I had was my parents' anxiety. I had never seen my parents, grown-ups, being totally devastated and in fear. Nevertheless, they dealt with it as adults. I went to school that morning and came back home, having been told in my school, which was a Jewish parochial school, that we had to behave and be very careful because we didn't know exactly what would happen to us. So that was really the main emotion, was watching my parents and feeling distraught because I had never seen my parents under such stress. Now, after that, my second and possibly most disturbing moment I had was 3 years later, when the Gestapo came to our apartment, banged on the door with rifles and wanted to take my dad. I learned later that they were taking 100 hostages. About 12 of them were Jewish leaders. And thank God, my father, who had the experience of anti-Semitism from his life in Czechoslovakia, he refused to open the door, which saved us, saved him certainly from the concentration camp to Theresienstadt, where he was supposed to be destined. Now, I remember this as sharply as you can imagine. As a psychologist, if I could step into that role, it was the kind of thing that we call flashbulb memory. It's the kind of memory that you have if you have post-traumatic stress. It just is an unbidden image that you can't get rid of. And that is one of the things that I have lived with throughout my life. In any case, I begged my father to open the door, but he refused. He said he would never want it to be taken alive. He was going to hide under the bed. He was going to go into the closet. He just was like a child, as far as I was concerned. I was afraid that if he didn't open the door, they would just shoot us. In any case, he did what he wanted to do, and that essentially rescued us because a neighbor upstairs yelled down to the Gestapo and said, they couldn't make that kind of noise at 4 in the morning. He would call the Danish police. That's the kind of humor that the Danes have. Now, the Gestapo asked, where are the Goldbergers? And the answer was from our Christian neighbor upstairs that they were in the country still. And he added, you know how Jews are, they always have a country place in the summer. So with that, the guards, the Gestapo left, leaving a big truck outside. We could see through the window. And after that, it was a strain that you couldn't believe. What to do, how to get out of the building without being seen. And those are details that are too painful to recall, but all I could tell you is, from myself, my father, he shaved his beard. He had a small Van Dyke beard. In order not to look too Jewish, once we eventually went on a train to where my mother and brother were hiding. Not hiding at that point, but they were there still in a rented summer house. You were going to ask a question.
Yes, I wanted to interject, Leo, and just share another photo or two from the time, and get your perspective as this particular photograph. You know, you look like you were a troublemaker.
This is not me. This is my older brother. He was a troublemaker.
This is your older brother? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, his name is Milan. He's 2 years older than me.
Oh, okay. Well, then let's jump to, I was going to say, you look like you probably gave the Germans a run for their money in those occupation years. But
I tried.
Talk a little bit about those years where you lived this new normal before this the knock on the door in late August. How did you go about life, learning, family?
I had a wonderful childhood. By the way, on the right-hand side, you see me with my father, just as they have finished building air shelters, because there was a lot of bombings by the Brits almost every night. And I spent many, many hours in the shelter, which we had also in each apartment house. And sometimes I was there for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the night until the siren would say that the raid was over. But I had a wonderful life. I had lots of friends. I went to a good school. I went to the synagogue every day. I was a pretty good boy. My brother had a little problem with not being such a good boy until he went to rabbinical school in America and left Denmark in 1946. And he, by the way, has no memory of this whole period, which is interesting, I think, that there are such differences between brothers.
So let's fast forward to the night, the days, the long days and long nights that constitute the center of the Danish experience, the kind of the third event in the of the pivotal moments of your life as a Danish Jew. You know, set the scene. I think you've said it was the morning of September 29th. Were you in the synagogue? Was your father there? You got word. Take us back and again, use the young Leo's eyes to tell, set the stage.
Well, first I have to indicate that after a couple of years of fairly quiet relationships between the Danish government and the Germans had an agreement with the Danes that the Danes could run their own country. There was the Danish government, there was the Danish king, there was police and army. We were supposed to get along with the Germans. We had what they called a policy of cooperation and negotiation. But by 1943, it all came to a head because there was a growing resistance to the German occupation. It began small, maybe 2,000 Danish resistance fighters, but as they began to get guns from the Brits dropped at night, they began to have enough to do sabotage that was very critical. They would bomb factories, they would bomb railroad tracks, which the Germans needed in order to get all kinds of stuff from Sweden and from Norway. So they became desperate, and in August the 28th, it came to a head. August 28th, 1943, they declared that the Danes had to kill on sight resistance fighters without due process. Now, the Danes had their laws, and it forbade that type of instant justice, and they refused. And at that point, the king went into isolation in his castle, and the whole government, all the secretaries at different departments, they quit. That led the Germans to be desperate because they didn't have enough manpower to run the civil side of a country. They had 100,000 soldiers stationed all across the country, but they had a very small group of police and Gestapo. I think they had less than 100 of those. So what to do? They decided they had to punish the Danes. And what they did was to announce in the newspaper after a while that they were going to punish the Jews. And we learned about this from a good German who was a diplomat named Duckwitz. I mention his name because he was recognized by Yad Vashem in Jerusalem for his good deed. And he was indeed a good guy. He had tried to quit the Nazi Party around 1942, but he wasn't able to. But he did this out of the goodness of his heart because he felt it was injustice was being done. Anyway, I will always be grateful to Duckwitz. Let me also say that because he contacted some Danish politicians, he told them what was going to happen within 2 days, which was we were going to be arrested and rounded up, put on 2 boats to take us to Germany, and from there to the camp in Theresienstadt, which was near Prague in the Czech Republic. So with that information, the Danish statesman got in touch with our president of our synagogue, and on the morning, the day before the Jewish New Year, we were told by our rabbi who had been informed that within 2 days, most likely, we would all be arrested when we were supposed to be at home, since it was the high holy days. And he asked everybody to leave quietly and not to return to the house except to pick up a few things and go into hiding. Now, you had asked me at one time a question, why didn't I call it escaping rather than the other concept, which is being helped to survive by, which is what I call it, which is rescue. I just wanted you to know, having thought about it, that if we didn't have rescuers, we couldn't escape. So to me, the concept of rescue is really the critical thing, because there was no way in hell that we could escape. We could hide for a while, but there were also quite a few informers. In fact, some 36,000 Danes were accused after the war of having been informers. So it wasn't easy. We had to be so careful about neighbors and so on. So one has to realize that when I talk about the good Danes, I'm obviously not talking about everybody, but there was a difference between the pro-German, of which the Nazis, there were about 20,000 Nazi party members in Denmark. So in any case, that was what caused us to leave the city, to go back to the country, and we were desperately trying to find some way to connect with a fishing boat. And my brother and I, my older brother and I, were sent by my father to the fishing villages along the coastline of Denmark, going all the way up to Elsinore, where Hamlet's castle is. And we tried to connect with a fishing boat, but we were told that was impossible. And that's where the resistance guys come in, because they were able to make connections, despite the fact that it cost quite a bit at the time. And that was reduced because the resistance folks told the fishermen that what they were doing was outrageous. They shouldn't cash in on helping people. In any case, we made the arrangement through the help of two wonderful people that I obviously still treasure the memory of. One was a minister of Lutheran, and the other was a wonderful woman who recognized my dad on the train because he had given some concerts for her group. And she is the one who connected us with the right people. And we were told where to be at a certain hour on the beach near the airport in Copenhagen. And that happened on October the 3rd, the day after the roundup. We had come a day early, but we begged the fishermen to let us stay because we had seen trucks with prisoners being taken to the police station on the way to the airport. And luckily, the fisherman allowed us to sleep on the floor in his apartment. And we were able to get to the beach, cold winter night in October with rain. We were waiting in the bushes for a signal to come. The boat was a small, relatively small fishing boat. I think it could have about 15 people. And it wasn't, there was no platform, it wasn't a harbor, it was just the beach. So the boat couldn't come in all the way. And we had to watch a signal of colored lights and start walking into the water. We dropped our suitcases because we were up to about sometimes the shoulder, depending on how tall we were. My mother being very short, we ended up losing most everything because my father carried two of my kid brothers. And I held on to one thing that I wanted to show you, which was my pride and joy. I had made this statue, my first nude, when I was 13 years old. I wanted to be a sculptor, and this was my product. And the fisherman broke it, and I have fixed it, as you can tell.
So, Leo, let me...
Anyway, that was my only object.
You know, that object,
yeah,
which was the one that you have to this day in your life, you kept, you told me you had it in a separate little bag over your shoulder so that your parents didn't really know that's what you were carrying and that was your precious possession. But why was that so special to you? You told me it was a symbol of the career you hoped to have.
Yes, it was my dream to become an artist. when I was a kid, and my father put me into afternoon work at George Jensen, which was a silver company, as you may know. And it was the beginning of drawing and drafting and designing. And then he put me in contact with a great sculptor. And I did this in the afternoon. So it meant the beginning of something that never came to pass, because when I came to Sweden, I didn't continue with what I would call my hobby. I was too busy learning Swedish first, and then because we were so many refugees there, altogether some 16,000 refugees, both Jews and children of underground people, resistance fighters who are on the run. So there were about 7,000 of Jewish refugees and 7,000 non-Jewish. So we had eventually our own school in Gothenburg and in Lund, Sweden.
Can I take you back to the fishing boat for a second?
Yeah.
To the boat. So I know people are curious about the circumstances around how fishermen were paid or not paid, and your family had a particular experience about that. Can you talk about that, both your family experience and general?
Well, the money situation was, of course, critical because we knew it would cost money. But my dad didn't have much in the bank. And his boss's offices, the Jewish community, they were closed. So he was pretty desperate. He went to our landlord to see if he could borrow money, but that was not possible. He made an arrangement to pay the rent from Sweden once, if we got there, through the resistance movement. So that was not an issue. And we had a housekeeper, and she would stay in the apartment. But to get back to money, this woman I mentioned, she connected my father with a minister who gave him 25,000 Danish money. It was quite a lot, and that's what it cost. It cost 5,000 per person, Danish money. After the war, my father wanted to give it back, but the minister refused to have him give it back. I think my own feeling about the fishermen, which I have explored since the US Holocaust Museum sent me to Denmark to find a boat to bring back to Washington to be on permanent exhibit there. I went around the harbor trying to make sure of the provenance of the boats, because quite a few might have said, we helped the Jews, but in fact, they didn't have any proof of it. In any case, I bought the boat and it was brought to Washington. And the rest of the story is that the time in Sweden went pretty quickly. They were very friendly to us, and none of us really wanted to remain there. So we lived day by day following the progress of the war. And as soon as the war ended on May the 5th, we were allowed to return home. And we came back to an apartment that was the way it was when we left, except for the fact that our maid had gotten used to living in a big apartment, and she refused to leave because she said it was now hers since the name had been changed on the door and the telephone book. So it got a little strained.
Leo,
but we were able to deal with it.
I want to go back to the night of your rescue. You've spoken in different interviews and places about your anger and rage and how it reached a pinnacle for you personally that night.
Yeah.
Talk a moment about that, and then how did you channel it? You seem a man to me, when I met you 30 years ago, of such grace and peace, that I don't see the anger in you. Talk about that. How did you felt it, but then you dealt with it?
Yeah, I've always been very sensitive to injustice and to anything smacking of prejudice. But be that as may, what happened was, sitting in the bushes during the rain on the night of October the 3rd, it was suddenly impossible for me to repress or to deny how I felt, which was I was ready to kill. I was so angry at the idea of being considered a second-class person who was being persecuted, being pursued. I kept thinking to myself, what in the world have we done to deserve this type of treatment? I was thinking of my poor mother and father who were desperate. Why was this happening? I really must say that I was suddenly so enraged that I can't even describe that moment. But you're quite right, because it's not my nature. I tend to be mild-mannered, and I also retrospectively chose a profession of therapy, of understanding, of focusing on empathy, of trying to make people take seriously the concept that we're all human beings. And I believe that one of the reasons why Denmark was an exception was the Danish people, a small group of people, just 4.5 million people. They were brought up by a certain Lutheran minister named Grundtvig to believe in these words, the golden rule, and that humans are all deserving of life. And I just feel very strongly that that's what made Denmark different from many of the other countries. But of course, I'm also aware of the fact that Denmark had very few Jews, so it wasn't such a big problem as it is, say, for example, it was in Holland with 140,000 Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Half of them were killed. And also the fact that we were close to Sweden, which obviously helped a lot because we had a place to escape. And also, I think that the idea that hasn't really been treated too seriously in the regular literature, except by historians, is the Germans during this occupation were not well staffed, and they were desperate to get out food, Danish food. So they didn't even insist that we wear stars of David, because among other things the king did, he refused to hear about this. He said, if they require Jews to wear the star, I would be the first to wear it. That's the truth of the legend. He didn't wear it and none of us wore it. Anyway, I just wanted to get that in since so many people ask me.
Yes, and I think that's excellent. It is one that comes up, and you write about it in detail in your book.
Yeah.
How the myth came to be and what the truth is. And I believe you have the king on your desk.
Yes.
Can you show us the king?
And I used to say hello to him as he passed our apartment building.
Do you not have the king right there with you?
he would come. Oh, I have him right here.
There you are.
Here he is.
And Leo reminded me just before we got on the webinar that that statue was actually a prop in the film A Day in October.
Exactly.
Leo has a cameo in that film where he is in the synagogue in Copenhagen, much as his father would have been in a scene from our movie. And I recall, Leo, that the set decorators had to paint over 1990 graffiti and then paint on 1940s graffiti on the barricades and the fencing outside the synagogue.
I don't remember that.
Yes, and then I also wanted to mention that apropos of fishing boats and the boats of rescue, I believe the Museum of Jewish Heritage is actually the keepers of, thanks to the Danish Parliament, I believe, of a Danish lighthouse tender boat, which was also used in the rescue effort, and that it's refurbished and it's docked up in Mystic. So if you can't touch Leo Goldberger, you can go touch that piece of Danish rescue history as well.
Yeah, in fact, I had a hand in getting it to Mystic, Connecticut when it was first given by the Danish government. I was in charge of the correspondence, which was in Danish. So
Leo, before we toss back to Samantha in a couple of minutes, I just want to tick through a few questions. She's going to have questions from the audience. I'm seeing hundreds of questions pop up on the chat. So good luck to Samantha weeding through all those. Your father was 40 at the time of this experience during the war and the rescue. When you turned 40, did you think back? What lessons did you infuse in your life from how your mom and dad helped you and your young brothers survive emotionally and physically?
Well, all I could tell you is that every year of his life, until he got quite old and retired to Jerusalem, he would send a telegram to the king or queen with his gratitude. He was absolutely so grateful to Denmark and he kept the response from the king or the queen as a treasured document, which I still have. The other thing I wanted to say was that he decided with a heavy heart to leave Denmark because he was worried about yet another war if the Soviets took over. And there was some indication that they weren't going to leave after they helped free Denmark in 1945. So he never forgot, and I never forgot. My mother, God bless her, she got Alzheimer's, and I think she was affected badly with stress. And when I was a consultant on a project at NYU Medical School on Alzheimer patients, I had a strong feeling that stress might have facilitated it because it can lay low for years, but it has made damage. And I spoke to experts on Alzheimer, and they agreed that that could be quite a possibility. But it happened late in her life. And I must say, it was quite a shock to me when she did not know who I was.
Leo, I'm sorry to hear that story. I wonder, so much, there is so much stress today. I'm not going to ask you to unpack the business and the challenges of 2020, but so many young people are having to grow up fast the way you did.
Yeah.
What would Professor Goldberger tell young Leo with the long years lens that you now have that might be informative or helpful to young people today dealing with a different set of stresses?
Yeah, let me say it's a good question. And one of the things that I think has been shown in terms of good empirical research is, is that if you are a hardy person who can take stress much better than people who are not able to, but they collapse quickly if there is any real stressful situation that they can't deal with. It seems that if you have early bouts with difficult situations, i.e. stressful situations, and you overcome them when you're young, it has benefits. But if you're born with a silver spoon in your mouth, if that's the right way to put it, you are unlikely to have this kind of preparation to become, as I call it, hardy, resilient. Resilient is the better word for it. So all I could say is, in my own case, I believe that what I went through in terms of observing stresses, but also my own stress, which I kind of absorbed from my parents, I think the fact that my parents dealt with it well, they didn't give up. Quite a few of our friends in Denmark gave up. There were friends we had, they did group suicide, the father, mother, and the children on the beach, because they were afraid that somehow they wouldn't be able to get across to Sweden. That was a dog that did not come from my room.
That's a dog under stress. I'm sorry, folks.
In any case, all I'm saying is, from my perspective, it has to be understood that early stress is not all that bad, because it prepares you for future potential stresses.
Well, thank you for that. And before I toss to Samantha now to share with you some of the questions from the incredible audience that's worldwide, 500 strong almost. I do want to say, Leo, back to that point, I mentioned how outside of my own film, A Day in October, directed by Kenneth Madsen, who sends greetings and is watching from Copenhagen right now.
Hi, Ken.
My great favorite film is The Great Escape. And I asked you that question about how this experience in Denmark is truly one of the greatest escapes stories in humankind.
Yeah.
And ranks up there with an extraordinary moment in history, unlike many that would compare. Is that not the case?
I agree fully. And I think that's why the story has continued to be told and will continue to be told. And let me just say, around the time when we met, I wasn't that keen on talking about this. I tried to forget about it. When I came to Canada and went to McGill, I just wanted to learn English and to become a good American and not to talk about this at all. But then I had the good fortune to meet and to have tea with Elie Wiesel. And he told me, after he asked me, so what did you do during the war? And I told him, and the first thing he said to me is, you must tell the story if you haven't done it so far. And that motivated me to tell my daughter. My wife, of course, I had told, but not my little dear one. Anyway, it's human nature to try to forget.
Thank you for choosing in the end not to forget, but to remember, and remember in full, to study the nooks and crannies of the experience, Leo. the bright sides and the dark sides of that experience. I think we could go on for another hour or more, but Samantha, if you're ready with a few questions from the field, please jump in. There you are. Hi.
Sure thing. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
We will do our best. I know that there are so many questions, and unfortunately, we won't have time to get to them all, but we'll do our best to at least get to a few in the remaining time that we have. So, Leo, this question comes from Aaron. Aaron is wondering if it's possible for you to recount your experiences as a child without the retrospective knowledge you gained as an adult. So in other words, how quickly did you lose whatever childhood innocence you might have had based on all that was going on around you? Was it instant or was it gradual?
No, I think it was right after, right in 1946, when I was a freshman at McGill. I wrote my story. So it was not much different from today.
Gotcha. Question from Mark. Mark asks if you asked the Danish government to intervene after the war when you returned to your apartment, which the maid had appropriated.
Yeah. Oh, and my father had to go to the police station. And just as he arrived with a policeman, the woman cried and asked for forgiveness. That was the end of the story.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Next question comes from Bennett. It's kind of a comment and a question rolled into one. So Bennett writes, I think Denmark is a wonderfully humane country, but I've always been aware of some mild anti-Semitism, both from living here for a year and visiting for the past 44. Over the past few weeks, Denmark has been trying to come to terms with its own history of racism and bigotry towards minorities. Could Leo give us an idea of his experiences and whether he ever felt like an outsider?
Well, I know they have negative feelings towards Muslims, unfortunately. One of the only explanation I have is that Denmark is like a small family, and they would like for guests to leave at a certain point or become Danes. And they feel that the Muslim immigrants are not trying to become Danes. And they're worried that they're trying to convert the rest of them to Buddha, to their Muslim religion, which I think is crazy, but that's the way the Danes are. They're very friendly, but they expect you to become Danish.
I see. Thank you for explaining that. Next question comes from Leslie. Mr. Goldberger, can you comment about how you think the supportive attitudes of the King Christian X and leading government members impacted the Danes' resistant movement and their efforts to rescue the Danish Jews? Do you think if the king and government were not supportive of the Jews, that these efforts would have been as effective?
No, I think, first of all, the king was very friendly towards Jews. His physician was Jewish, and he was arrested when they came from my dad, and my dad didn't open the door. And his physician was taken, and the king immediately got him released. But let me just say that I think that the Danes did what they did as soon as there was no government to tell them not to do things like that, like helping Jews. They had quit, and the king was in residence, and he didn't play any role whatsoever at that point.
Thank you. Shira asks if you and your family remained religious after the war.
Oh, my entire family were super religious, except for myself. I dropped out of rabbinical school where I spent about 6 months, but it wasn't my cup of tea. So, and my parents accepted me, and they accepted my life as a person who was focused on secular knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a few questions here about your thoughts on the young adult book, Number the Stars, if you're familiar with it.
Yeah. Well, I remember the book, and I was very impressed with it at the time when I read it. But I can't say I remember too much of it. It was for children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually remember reading it in elementary school. That was one of the first Holocaust books, I think, that was ever assigned.
Except for Anne Frank.
Right. Well, I'm saying for my age group, like we
Yeah.
read Number the Stars before the Diary of Anne Frank.
Yeah. Lowry, what's her name? Yeah.
Lois Lowry. Question actually for Damian. How can we watch the movie A Day in October?
Well, thank you for that question. Actually, the director and producer of the film, Kenneth Madsen, is watching from Copenhagen. He's busy raising funds to redigitize the film and get it sold to one of the streaming services. We had a great premiere back in 1992. It played on television for years, and now the rights are in Kenneth's hands, and Kenneth is working hard to redigitize in high res the film and make Leo look great again.
Okay. I'm in the film. I don't know if you remember.
I remember.
Yeah.
You had a haircut then.
And I wore a top hat.
Yeah.
Fabulous. And I think we will also be scheduling a program with Kenneth in the future about the Gerda 3.
Yeah.
So stay tuned for that. It will probably happen at some point later in the summer. I'm excited for that one as well. We have time for just one more question. Another question for Leo that comes from Jane. How did Leo prevent his young, frightened children from making any noise when the Germans knocked on his door?
I didn't understand the question.
The question, sorry, is, whoops. How did you prevent the children from making any noise when the Germans knocked on your door?
In August 43, Leo,
Yeah.
you were 13, but your younger brother was you say that he was given a sleeping pill for the fishing boat. Did he have to be hand over mouth in the middle of the night in August?
My own memory for that, which is a conflict I've had with my brother for the past 25, 30 years. I don't think he was in the apartment. I think it was just me and my older brother. But my kid brother insists he was there. So, and if he's watching, I now believe you were there, but I don't know how you felt.
I'm glad we could come to resolution over the decades over Zoom. You and your brother.
I'm glad as well. I'm really happy that we had this opportunity to bring you guys together for this reunion, so to speak, over Zoom.
Can I make one
remark
before you close out? I just want all those, I don't know the faiths and backgrounds of our 500 some participants right now, but I can tell you as an Irish Catholic kid from Staten Island, New York, having what I thought was a great education. In fact, I grew up learning almost nothing about the Holocaust. That has echoes for other situations we're living through today. But it was Leo, who, as I said at the start, he opened his heart, his home, his homeland, his faith, and his family to me. And he was my teacher. And here we are 3 decades later, trying to tell that same story anew for new audiences. And I hope our education systems have done a better job with Samantha's generation and others to come with teaching those stories that are less taught or were less taught and should be primary today.
Yeah, and I thank you both, Samantha and Damian, for making this possible. I think it was a great honor to be asked, and I'm a little embarrassed by my emotional facial reactions, but I can't help it, so be it.
Yeah, thank you, Leo. No need to be embarrassed. This was so touching and beautiful. Damian, thank you guys again for coming together and allowing us to take part in this wonderful reunion conversation. To our audience watching, please go out and buy Leo's book, The Rescue of Danish Jews, if you want to learn more about this chapter of history. And also look up the information about A Day in October. Hopefully we'll find out from Kenneth when that digitized edition will be available. And of course, we will let you guys know as soon as we know. For those of you asking, this program was recorded. It will be uploaded to the museum's YouTube channel early next week. And I will send out a link to that recording as soon as it's up. So make sure to look out for that. And please continue watching our museum virtual public programs. These happen twice weekly, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, New York time. And later this summer, we will be doing a program about the Gerda III, which ties directly into the story of the Danish Jewish rescue. So make sure to look out for that. And thank you to our wonderful speakers. Once again, this was really phenomenal.
Thank you for your interest.
Bless you, Leo.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.